Baked Bros presents the Know Your Dose podcast. Join hosts Thomas Rimbach, Nadeem Alhassan, and Derek Espinosa as they turn the soil on the cannabis industry. With over 20 years of combined industry experience, these three experts will deliver your dose of cannabis, psychedelics, and personal development. Follow on their journey as they aim to destigmatize cannabis, combat the abuse of pharmaceuticals, and implement their altruistic approach into the budding cannabis industry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go.
Know?
You right, Big T. Have you guys watched Have a Good Trip on Netflix that just came out?
I started it.
Nice. I finished it. I watched it last night. Thomas, you're starting to say something. It sounded like you loved it.
Well, yeah, I absolutely loved it. Well, it's a story. It's a bunch of stories, and hearing the way that these stories are, like if I was somebody that had never been introduced to psychedelics from a different standpoint, I would have thought it was a party drug. It's not something that's like, they're talking about their experiences of seeing, hallucinations and stuff, and I think that's just that. All that does is cater to the same issue that we already have with psychedelics, which is not understanding what they're really should be used for. And I don't think that was a good look on it. If you start explaining science and explaining how helps people, not how some celebrity had a cool experience with it, that's where I don't align with it, man.
Definitely. So it's definitely not about the science of psychedelics. That
what was the name of it again?
Have a Good Trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's on Netflix.
I thought it was pretty funny. I thought it was pretty cool, to see some, I guess, higher caliber people or actors and musicians and, things like that are people like that were sharing their experiences. I mean, definitely relatable experiences. that's unarguable. That I'm like, yep, been there, seen that. And they did have one section with one guy who kind of reminded me of Derek, except maybe 60, 70 years old. And it's literally what Derek will be in 60 or 70 years. He's just, he literally looked like Derek, but he talked a little bit about the science and, its status for mental health. And I believe he went on to say he has one of the only grants or whatever it's called to be able to study psilocybin with certain mental illnesses.
I wonder if it was Roland Griffiths?
It wasn't Roland Griffiths. Okay. Yeah, no.
I think that
if you go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of that documentary, I think one of the things that it was, because it definitely wasn't a science piece.
No.
But I think it's the first of its kind in terms of getting people who are in the public perception to come out and say, yeah, I've taken a psychedelic and I'm just fine.
I'm fine. Exactly.
You know what I mean? Because you
exactly.
have people on there who were iconic, right? Like Ben Stiller was on there. Sting was on there.
Right.
There were a couple others that like you'd recognize from comedy shows. And of course, it's going to be the comedians and the musicians who come out first and say, hey, we took these drugs and it led to creative insight. And sure, some people will be swayed by that. Some people won't. But the next round will be, when athletes are saying, hey, I've taken psychedelics and
totally,
business
and
executives.
It boosted my performance.
Right.
You say that is that what you gathered from it? Is that what you gathered while watching that? Is that, other normal people, I guess, which is actually not even true. They're far from normal, right? There's such a high caliber of people, right? And but is that what you picked up from that? It was like, oh, okay, well then
yes.
It's okay. That's what you got from it?
I didn't get that.
Do you think that anybody that hasn't had that?
I think what I got, I didn't get that it's okay and a stamp of approval to go do, because it was primarily about LSD. So let's just clear that up. They talk about other psychedelics, but for the most part, LSD is the most recreational, party psychedelic out there, when it comes to musicians and things like that. So I did, to Derek's point though, what I did gather from it is like, yeah, you have these people just like us. Okay, everyday people. They just happen to be actors or musicians that use these drugs, and in the end, they're just fine. I mean, and they'll even tell you in that they're like, you know what, you took it's literally like we talked about in last week's episode on what to do with a bad trip with cannabis. And one of the pieces of advice were remind yourself that you took this drug and this is why you're acting this way, and it's not forever. That was the biggest piece. It's not forever. This is only momentary, and momentary may be a few hours, but it's going to go away.
Yeah.
And I think that's been one of the things that back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that they really drove home, was like, it's going to fry your brain. You're going to go insane, and you're going to remain insane, and you're going to have babies with dragon heads and all kinds of crazy shit, which isn't true, So
yeah, I think in terms of if I was trying to get someone to get interested in psychedelics for the first time, that is not the documentary that I would show them.
Yeah,
that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, but in terms of like, let's see, if it was somebody who was into comedy or into music, maybe. But in terms of general public, no. That movie was made for people who already were fans of psychedelics. You can tell from the animations.
Definitely.
You could tell from the way the comedians were talking. Like, that wasn't made for people who are new to this.
And that just doesn't, to me, that doesn't make a change. It's not progressively moving that impact forward. And I think that, if you had somebody like Sam Harris get on there and talk about psychedelics, not just because of how much more in tune he is, but the reason he uses it. He will share stories of how it helped him and get through life. That other stuff was just fairy tales. Like, it's like, oh, I saw all these crazy things. That's not what we're trying to do. When you go and you talk to MAPS, or you talk to these Roland Griffiths, you talk to these people that are trying to get this through, you don't get that through and accepted by society by having reefer madness as the poster child of an LSD trip. And I know that's a little bit different, but you need to show people that, connect with them, emotionally, where it's like, my father stopped smoking cigarettes, and he smoked for 35 years and did one psilocybin, experience, and stopped. That's how you get people to progressively offer this and tell people to show, to research it a little bit more. I don't think that the way that they did that was really professional, in my opinion.
I just don't think that was the goal of this piece. Like, Netflix did another series, The Mind Explained. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
and they talk about psychedelics there, and that's the one. If you were to show somebody that was new, that's the one you want to show them, right? Like, that does a super good job of detailing the history, detailing where the science is currently at, where we're going. This is definitely a little silly.
It was still pretty groovy though. But with that being said, there's three things that I want to really go over with this episode. We do advocate for psychedelics, and we haven't had a dedicated episode to psychedelics. But some of the things I'd like to cover are: what's the history behind psychedelics, what the current state of psychedelic science is, like right now, and then how are people using psychedelics outside of mental health, right? So before we dive into psychedelic science, let's go over what psychedelics are. What does the word psychedelic mean, Derek?
Psychedelic comes from the Greek words psyche and delos, which means mind manifesting. And so, it was coined by this guy named, I think his name was Humphrey Osmond. He was the brother-in-law, I believe, to Aldous Huxley, who wrote Heaven and Hell and The Doors of Perception, which was kind of the iconic... An
island.
Yeah, an island. Brave New World is probably the one that most people are familiar with. But they were really, two of the gentlemen who were at the forefront of the second wave of psychedelic science. And so that was the word that he landed on that he felt like best described what was happening to your mind. There's other words that people try to use, like psychomimetic, which means psychotic mimicking, which isn't a very good descriptor. Some people use the term entheogen, which means to reveal the God within. I personally like psychedelic because I feel like it does describe the experience very well. It's revealing, your own mind.
I really like entheogen. It can have some pretty profound connections with the divine, whether you believe in it or not. So it just can. But classical psychedelics versus other compounds, like with similar properties. And so what could some of those be? Let's say we could use cannabis, and we could use Gosh, why am I having a brain fart?
Mushroom?
Synthetic
Psilocybin?
THC.
Oh, Marinol.
Marinol, I mean, that's what. How can we compare that to the psychedelic world, right? You have LSD with as a synthetic compound,
Mhm.
right? But that's not like psilocybin, which comes from a mushroom.
So typically when people are talking about classical psychedelics versus non-classical psychedelics, they're talking about psychedelics that bind to serotonin receptors. So LSD would fall in that category. DMT, LSD, for those that don't know, it is a synthetic compound, but it's derived. It was originally derived from the ergot fungus, which grows on rye. And then you have psilocybin, which comes from psilocybin mushrooms or magic mushrooms. There's DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is found in our bodies. It's something that our bodies produce. It's also found in lots of other plants.
Yeah, pretty much every other plant has some type of ratio to it, right?
Yeah,
Right,
it's a
what's the
huge proportion.
I've never understood that though. So like, what's the concentration though? Like in all of these plants?
Probably
It's
higher than others.
It's
Yeah,
it's
it
obviously
depends.
very abundant in ayahuasca, but what is the concentration in other plants if they say DMT is in all plants?
It's not in all plants. It's in a lot of plants.
Okay.
There's certain trees here in Arizona. The ones with the bean pods. You know which ones I'm talking about? They like
Yes,
fall
I
every
do.
year.
Yeah, there's some right at Salad and Go, and I look at them and I'm like, hey.
Yeah, so there's a specific strain of those, but that contains some portion of DMT. It's very, very small. It also contains nicotine. Nature doesn't do things by accident, and once it creates something that works, it just keeps building off of that, right? So DMT is a compound that, for whatever reason, was beneficial to plants. It was beneficial to humans, and so nature kept replicating it. So that's why DMT is found in so many different plants.
Okay, so
There's
sticking
one
with
more. There's one more, and that's mescaline. Mescaline is another serotonergic compound that's found in the peyote cactus and the San Pedro cactus.
So you're saying that you can't say cannabis is because it doesn't attach to a serotonin receptor is basically your distinction between that.
Correct. So if we're talking about from a scientific perspective, classical psychedelics, cannabis would not be included in that. If you're talking about it from a political perspective, then yes, cannabis is usually lumped into the psychedelic group. But so is a lot of other compounds.
My grandma would just say anything that alters your brain state is a psychedelic. So I guess that's kind of how most people think about it. Yeah, right. But that makes more sense from a science standpoint to have to distinguish it between serotonin receptor uptake or not.
Right.
Okay, so let me recap that. You have LSD, lysergic acid, right? Comes from the ergot. Okay. You have DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is abundant in ayahuasca and many other plants, right? You can also get 5-MeO DMT, which is a stronger variation of DMT, which comes from the Sonoran bull toad or bullfrog, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then you've got mescaline, which comes from peyote. And you've got psilocybe, which comes from mushrooms. So are we sticking with those four, or what about something like ketamine?
So ketamine is it's a dissociative. It's actually very similar to PCP, which has its own history. But they're drugs that typically disassociate you. Ketamine has been lumped into this category. It's not a classic psychedelic, but it is lumped into the psychedelic category because it does produce these profound altered states of consciousness, and they are looking at it as to help relieve depression and suicidal ideation. But it's not acting through serotonin, the serotonin system, so it's not considered a classic psychedelic.
So MDMA is for sure acting on the serotonin system.
It is, but it's also acting on the dopamine system, and it acts much more similar to an amphetamine. So that's why it's not considered a classic psychedelic on its own. Like, it typically doesn't produce the same types of visuals as a classic psychedelic. It has a much stronger emotional component
and sensation
altering. So it gets lumped in that category, but if we're talking classic psychedelics, it wouldn't make the cut. Ibogaine is another one.
I was going to ask, what about ibogaine? Because I've seen this. I've read a lot on that being used for addiction.
Yeah, so that comes from a a shrub, like the bark of a shrub in Africa, and it's used in
Iboga.
iboga, and it's used traditionally in Africa for like rites of passage and things like that. But they found it to be incredibly useful for treating addictions. But it is also not considered a classical psychedelic. That's probably the one that I know the least about. But I do know that it has an extremely long duration. It can sometimes last 36 hours.
Woo.
And the visual component's a little bit different as well. It's not as it's not the same type of visuals. People describe it as having like your higher self, or something talking to you and giving you a lot of insight, but it's not this super visual experience.
So I think you bring up a good point when talking about visualizations, right? Because I was under this impression for the longest time. Guys, one of the main reasons I ate mushrooms for the first time almost 10 years ago now was I wanted to see some shit. Like I wanted, like I heard that you see stuff, and like I wouldn't say I was let down, but it wasn't what I was expecting. Not with mushrooms. Like I didn't have the type of visuals that I've had today, and so and I'll circle back around to that. But can you explain the difference between a hallucinogenic psychedelic and just a psychedelic, like MDMA? Not very visual, right?
Yeah. So go ahead, Thomas. What were you gonna say?
I was just going to say, technically, he said that MDMA is not a psychedelic. So
Right. I'm using that as okay. Okay. So,
I know
there
what
are
he means. I just wanted to.
Yeah, there are psychedelics that are not hallucinogenic, and there are psychedelics that are hallucinogenic.
So the classical psychedelics would be considered hallucinogenic,
Okay.
and that's because they alter your perception. A hallucination is just when you see something, hear something, taste something that's not actually there, and you know it's not actually there, right? A
Mhm.
delusion, which is a different thing, is when you see something but you believe it's actually there. So
Mhm.
we have this idea that hallucinations are these things that are real scary and abstract, and but the reality is that we actually hallucinate all the time. I mean, have you ever heard something, you thought you heard something and then it was something else, right? That's a
Yeah.
hallucination. Or when you think you see somebody and then you're like, oh shit, that was just a tree. That's a hallucination, right? Your brain made a prediction based on what it saw. It made a wrong prediction, and then you course correct to go, oh silly, that's just a tree.
I personally like the hallucinations that come with the classical psychedelics, like LSD in particular. It's just, I don't know. That's where for me, it most often than not, and largely dose dependent. The hallucinations that do occur are never what they make it seem like in the movies, like
Never.
little leprechauns or pink elephants coming around or anything silly like that. And hey, there's probably somebody out there listening right now that's like, well, you didn't take enough. Well, I've taken enough, and I've also do not find any need to take 10 tabs of LSD. So if that's what you consider enough, then more power to you, buddy. But I'll stick, with my dose.
There's different
think,
brain chemistry too. Other people can
Yes.
absolutely, experience that.
Yeah, there's a guy named Oliver Sacks, who was a neurologist. He was pretty famous. He wrote a lot of really interesting books, and he worked with a lot of different patient populations. But one that he wrote a book on hallucinations, and it wasn't about psychedelics. It was about regular people who hallucinate, and it was like, I can't remember the percentage, but it's a small subset of people who are blind have really vivid visual hallucinations.
ooh,
So they can't see, but they'll have a hallucination of, let's say, Tweety Bird. And it's a cartoon, and it's literally right in front of their face, and they can't stop seeing it. And it's because your brain has all these different cells that are coded for different things. And so, your brain has a spot coded for cartoons. That's why you can see cartoons. So like Thomas is saying, some people's brain chemistry, when they do take a psychedelic substance, that could be the piece that's activated, and they could see those types of things. My experience. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, with my experience, it's not outward. It's always a visual inward. Like it's like my imagination.
Yeah, that's the best way to describe it. Is it's where your imagination overlaps on reality. So you're closing your eyes, and things that you would typically see in your mind's eye become much more vivid. And so, and there's different levels to that, right? So like some people see walls melting, or they see the carpet breathing. And really, you're just becoming more aware of what you're already perceiving. Like there's constant vibrations moving throughout this room as I'm talking, but I'm not seeing that. My brain has
Right.
filtered out all those types of things. Every time I move my head, my eyes are subtly shifting, but my brain makes it this cohesive view. And so when you notice those things that your brain filters out, it seems really bizarre. You're like, whoa, everything's moving. It's not moving. You're just becoming aware of the tiny eye movements that you have, the way your breathing affects your perception, all these different little things.
Well, okay, let's get back to history, right? So let's go through. So what would be the we know that ayahuasca has been a part of tradition for so many years. LSD was way after humans were using ayahuasca. Can we get a brief history on kind of what's the oldest psychedelic that we know of that we still use today? Because I'm sure there are older psychedelics that are not available nowadays that people used to use for that. So yeah.
Man. So what's interesting is, as far back as 40,000 years ago, we have cave paintings with what look like psilocybin containing mushrooms.
What is it that makes that? Is that
it's the shape,
the colors, or the shape? Okay.
Yeah. So
looks
there's
just like a mushroom.
certain varieties of psilocybin mushrooms have a certain shape, and so someone like Paul Stamets, he wouldn't be willing to go out on a limb and say, yeah, for sure, those are psilocybin containing mushrooms, but they look very similar. And also, you got to think about it. Prehistoric man finds this mushroom, eats it, has these weird visuals. He's going to start painting that stuff. Right. And so some of the imagery of these paintings has led people to believe that could be the case as well. So that's
because it's similar now. Because we have people that are alive now that have experienced that same feeling. I'm like, yeah, that's what I would have done several thousand years ago too if I was on that and had no electricity, right? And had no agriculture.
Isn't there a theory called the stoned ape theory that suggests that a monkey or a chimpanzee ate a mushroom and that's what kind of like propelled evolution for our brains?
Yeah. So Terence McKenna proposed that theory. It has never held up to scientific scrutiny, and not to say that it hasn't held up because it's not real. It hasn't held up because there's not a lot of logical scientists that are willing to put their stake at
the reputation,
their reputation on the line to say this was the case. But it makes a lot of sense. So the idea is that we do know that we originated from sub-Sahara Africa, and we were some kind of tree-dwelling species that rarely came down other than to gather food. Well, one thing we do know that monkeys are attracted to is mushrooms. Okay. We also know that these psilocybin-containing mushrooms grow out of cow dung or cow poop. Okay. And so it would make sense that, there were cattle, they were pooping, mushrooms were growing, these chimps would go down, they would eat it. And obviously, if you've ever taken one of these substances, you know how mind-blowing it is. And there are some benefits to it, right? There's creative insight associated with it. At lower doses, you actually have enhanced visual acuity, a little bit higher doses. It can be an aphrodisiac. So all of these qualities that it produces could enhance your fitness or your ability to survive long-term. So the idea is that along with all the other things we know contributed to evolution, this could have been part of the story that's missing. And we also know that, humans have been altering their consciousness for millennia. Like this isn't a new phenomenon, right? Like the cave painting shouldn't surprise anybody because the Egyptians were altering their consciousness with plants. Pretty much every society we know of has altered its consciousness with some plant, whether, and so yeah, it just shouldn't be surprising. And in terms of other cultures, I mean, we have the Eleusinian mysteries, which took place in Greece. Our Western culture is built on Greek philosophy. Well, it's not an accident that a lot of these philosophers were a part of this ancient tradition that drank this drink called kykeon once a year. And they said they were basically thrown into the underworld and were able to see, visions and talk with deities. And then they would come out of that with this inspiration and go live their life for the next year. And it was something super secret.
Even then they knew that it should be a once a year thing when you dive in like that, right?
Well, there's a story.
I don't want to use the word should, but even then they knew that it was that impactful where they weren't eating it every day, right? This was,
right. Absolutely. Well, there's a story one of the reasons why the tradition died was because there was a gentleman who took the drink and took it to a house party, basically, and that was punishable by death. And they decided that people were going to start taking this stuff, and so they shut the whole thing down. It was something that was a part of the Aztec tradition. So we know that the Aztecs used psilocybin mushrooms and peyote. And I mean, you just look at their temples and they're
Together.
I don't know about together. They believe so. I think they use them separately for different things. But I mean, the word that the Aztecs used for psilocybin mushrooms translates to flesh of the gods.
Right.
Right. And then in South America, like you alluded to, we've had ayahuasca use there for thousands of years. Wachuma use, which is the San Pedro cactus, similar to peyote in the northern or southern region of North America. So yeah, I mean, and shoot, man, go ahead.
I want to touch on ayahuasca, right? So obviously we're talking about most of these are plant derivatives.
Mhm.
Literally all of them were until LSD kind of came around. But but ayahuasca is not just, you don't just like a mushroom. You buy you get a magic mushroom, you eat it, and then you can have that experience through
Mhm.
it. Ayahuasca, you cannot do that. It doesn't work that way. You have to have the addition of another plant, which was what was the name of it? I'm blanking
There's
on it.
trichruna and there's ayahuasca. Trichruna is the plant that contains DMT, and the ayahuasca, the vine of the souls, contains
MAO inhibitor.
harmaline, which is an MAO inhibitor.
And what that basically does is it slows down the breakdown in our body. So if we, when people talk about smoking DMT, it's more of a faster onset and a faster, getting done with it as well. But the MAO inhibitor slows that breakdown down, and so now that allows our body to really indulge in that, whatever that experience it is. And the point what I wanted to bring that up was that that's two different plants, okay? And for humans to be able to figure that out, that's a long time.
Yes.
That is a long time of family gatherings and ceremonies to determine that.
In the most ecologically diverse part of the entire world, the Amazon basin, right? There's more plant species there than anywhere else. And for them to find these two disparate plants and figure out that if you combine them, it does this thing, that's insane.
And it's not insane, but it is bizarre, which could be two in the same. But I would suggest that anybody that's listening that has had a fairly larger dose of psychedelics, will it be LSD, psilocybin, DMT, primarily those three, and you've been in nature with those at a high dose, or you've just been in your backyard, the plants seem to come alive. And I'm not talking like come alive with little faces and button eyes or bubble eyes that
there's a communication that you can connect with.
Exactly. There's a communication occurring, and it's as real as this conversation that we're having now. And I know that's really hard to fathom for a lot of people listening. It's definitely borderline inexplicable at times, and I'll do my best, but the communication is as real again as this conversation that's occurring. And so I could see how, whether it be thousands of years ago, when there's not as much stimulus going on or stimuli going on as there is today, with cars and electricity and phones and business and all that jazz, that when they did eat these mushrooms, they ended up having some form of communication, which then there led them or suggested which plants, have healing properties.
So I think that I think one of the things that's valid in what you're saying is that these people were way more in tune with nature than we are, because their entire survival depended on them being in tune with nature. Yeah. They needed to know what the herds were doing, what the different animals were doing. Were they poisonous? Were they not poisonous? What does that plant do? What does that plant do? Their whole survival. Their whole medical system was based on the plants in their region. So
that didn't work. We'll try something else. Oh, that shit worked for Steve. Mm-hmm. Well, let's see if it works for Alan.
And then the other piece was, shamanism for a lot of these ancient cultures was the standard, right? Which is using altered states of consciousness to access information. So there definitely was that component. Now, you could take a super spiritual viewpoint and say they were accessing spirits or they were connecting with the
And
essence of
that's
the
what I'm
plant.
suggesting.
And you could also take a reductionistic perspective and say, no, they just gathered a bunch of data in their minds based on their experience and their tradition. And when they were under the influence of these plants, all that came together, wove itself into a cohesive narrative that said, this plant speaking to me and telling me to put it with this other one. So,
I vote that one.
I oscillate back and forth between the two, and that's the beautiful thing is we can't necessarily prove one or the other, right? So we need both perspectives. But
know that they've. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say to finish out, in terms of history. So we had the Aztecs, we had the Greeks, we had the Egyptians, and then Vikings. Wow. So that's actually a really good one.
The Berserkers.
The Berserkers. Yeah. So people don't realize that the Berserkers were, they think that these Vikings were consuming Amanita muscara mushrooms. These are the mushrooms that you typically see in cartoons with red caps and white dots.
This is your emoji mushroom.
Yeah. Way more toxic than magic mushrooms. And causes psychotic, violent behavior in some people. And so they think that the Vikings would take this mushroom before they went on, a berserker raid and basically under the influence do what Vikings did. And then again, from a physiological standpoint, I mean, one of the things this mushroom does is decrease pain sensitivity a lot. And so, the tales of the Vikings were that they were super hard to kill, that, a slash that would kill a normal man wouldn't stop them. Again, you're under the influence of this plant that
like being on PCP.
Yeah, exactly. It has dissociative properties as well, so fits right in line. The story of Santa Claus comes from the same mushroom. So there's
Why don't you explain that just because?
Okay, yeah, this is awesome.
It's a Polish tribe.
Yeah, exactly. So again, shamanism, right? These shamans would collect these mushrooms that grew at the bottom of conifer trees or Christmas trees, and then they would hang them on the Christmas tree to dry them out. Or what they would do is they would, collect them and then they would distribute them to the people in the tribe. Typically, this place is frozen, so they would have to climb through the chimney in order to get into the huts of the people living there, and then they would hang those in socks above the fireplace. So you can see that these little elements, right, all made their way into the Christmas story that we know, which was this guy who wears a funny hat and red clothes, a shaman, comes through the chimney and delivers this mushroom or present, and he puts it in stockings above the fire or underneath the tree where the actual mushroom grows. And so, you think about hundreds of years and that getting muddled down, and then you have Coca-Cola Santa Claus.
This is before the German story of Santa Claus too. So this predates because a lot of people are under the impression that Santa Claus comes from a German tale, and this predates that.
Exactly. So that tale or this tale informed the German tale, which informed our tale of Santa Claus. Right. So yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other
which represents Christianity, which represents not doing psychedelics at all.
Oh, so that's where I was going.
So weird.
I'm so glad you brought that up, man. So we have these huge traditions in terms of religions. One being Christianity, and if you look at the early, the Old Testament at least, one of the things that the priests did is they went into the tabernacle, which was this basically, church on wheels that they would roll around with, and only one priest, the holiest of the holies, was allowed to go into this thing, and they would burn incense, and we don't know all the plants that went into that, but he would come out with revelations. So, I mean, there's some scholars who believe that whatever they were cooking up in there was probably hallucinogenic, which again would make sense.
You've got Moses in the burning bush, and you've got holy anointing oil, right? Which consisted of, I think, pounds of hemp seed oil. Which again, not a psychedelic. I know but I'm just saying there are stories with the context of plant medicines being used in the old text,
right? And so there's what were you going to say, Thomas?
I was going to say, let's sum up the history part because we still haven't talked much on how LSD was derived. Like we know, but
so long story short, it's been littered throughout all of human history, most of which we're just not told because that's not a narrative that our historians typically want to highlight. They think of it as something primitive, right? So it's not worth talking about.
And before we wrap up the world history of it, like let's buckle down on the history of it in the U.S.
So
Right,
that's a super interesting story.
That's where LSD starts at all. Like that's where,
particularly LSD and psilocybin.
Okay, so LSD was really the start, like you were saying, and there was a gentleman by the name of Albert Hoffman who was working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland, and he'd been messing around with a bunch of these ergot derivatives to try. I think it was like a heart medication that he was trying to, find something interesting for, and he tried LSD 25 on monkeys, and they didn't like it. He didn't think anything of it. He got a little bit on his hand, and he started to feel kind of funny. A couple years go by, and one day he wakes up and just has this thought that he should go back and check out that LSD 25 again. So he goes back to the lab, synthesizes it, and takes a massive dose, like 250 to 500 micrograms, which is equivalent to like 2 to 5 tabs of acid. Doses himself, thinking this is a relatively small dose because not many compounds are that potent, and he has the world's first acid trip. So he's super intrigued. They start sending it to psychiatrists. Basically, they just sent LSD for free to whoever wanted it because they didn't really know what it did, and they were trying to find uses for it. At that same time, there is a American banker. His name was Gordon Wasson, and he had heard about this Mexican woman in Mexico who was doing mushroom ceremonies. So he goes down there, has a mushroom trip, and then writes about it in Life magazine, which was one of the largest publications at the time. At that same time, you have Aldous Huxley, who writes The Doors of Perception, because he had tried mescaline, because mescaline was discovered in the late 1900s. And so there's all this buzz around it, but it hasn't really made it to the popular culture yet, right? Well, in like 1960, there are some researchers at Harvard University, Tim Leary and Rupert Albert, something like that. Ram Dass is what he's known as now. And they start doing psilocybin research. Well, they didn't think it was going fast enough. One of them gave it to an undergraduate student. They both get fired in this huge scandal. And that kind of kicked off the 1960s. And then at the same time, so that's on the East Coast. On the West Coast, what's happening is that the CIA is working on a project called MK Ultra, and they're giving LSD covertly to different groups of people, experimenting on them. Well, one of these people happened to be Ken Kesey, and he got a hold of one of those barrels of LSD and started distributing it to everybody who would take it on the West Coast. So that's kind of how the 1960s psychedelic outbreak happened. Was academia on the East Coast, the political, sphere on the West Coast, and it just basically jumped out of the lab. And then, we know from there that Timothy Leary became this big showboat and started telling people to take acid all the time. And it kind of just got out of control, and the government clamped down on it in 1970, locked the key, and then for the next 20, 30 years, there was absolutely no research done on psychedelics, which is unheard of in science.
Right. Because a lot of headway was being made too until that plug got pulled. Yeah, it's very interesting. MK Ultra, that's a whole other podcast that we should talk about.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole. But like last thing on that, like you said, is that there was a lot of good research that was done. There were a lot of promising results. It just was the media sensationalized a few bad apples, and it kind of collapsed the whole initiative.
It sucks, man, because like you're saying, a lot of them were making good headway and very progressive breakthroughs until I think you said 1970s, but it was like 1967 or somewhere around there that it got pulled. And cause Sandoz was, like you said, distributing LSD. I've timed those for a few hours long.
Hey, last thing on the history, because I forgot this piece, but Bill Wilson, the guy that was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, was actually an advocate of LSD.
Right.
Because he felt like it led to spiritual breakthroughs, which is a part of the process. So that was pretty interesting too.
Let's be real. People don't keep, even if it was escape the lab, people don't keep taking it because it makes them feel like shit. People don't keep taking it because it makes their life worse.
No, definitely
Right?
not.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many, it just says it right there. You know, you can only hide it so long. And it actually blows my damn mind that one government could shut down research on something
It's
that
scary.
is so ununderstood, not understood. That's a shitty way of saying that, but just not understood.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy.
For the entire world.
Right.
And it's I feel I'm just not I don't have the merit to really talk about it without it sounding like conspiracy, so I choose really not to. If you understand what I'm saying. But,
Fine line, man. Because
right,
everybody's got these predisposed beliefs about it, and so you
Mhm.
can't trigger that. You have,
right.
yeah. It's
But,
interesting.
but the amount of information that I and we, because we consume a lot of the same information between books, podcasts, investing time to actually read them, articles. I mean, it is really clear that like that it was a big scandal. You know, it just MK Ultra alone. You know, it's like it's really clear on what was going on, and of course, there's always going to be unknowns. But again, let's do a part 2 on that. Because yeah, if you ask me, I'm all for it. But Q&A sesh. All right.
Ding, ding, ding,
Hey,
ding.
so Canna Mama, she wants to know what is most important to you in a cannabis company? Ooh, that's a pretty good question. What is most important to you in a cannabis company?
Authenticity, real, being in this business to help people and not to just fill your pockets like some of the competitors that we know.
So how do you know if okay, you make a good point. Like we know. We're in the industry. We have a
Look
little
at the
bit more
story.
insider data.
Look
Look
at
at
the
the
story
story.
of these products. If you can't find a story and it's a typical, we just want to make the best products ever for cannabis, then there's nothing there, that because there's no story there, because you got into it because you wanted to fill your pockets. If there was a story there, you would tell it, because that's marketing 101.
You know, I won't name drop anybody. We've even watched interviews of some of our, competitor brands where literally when they're being asked, why'd you get into this? They're like, well, I got into it for the money. And it's like, I can't believe you just said that.
Right.
Like, wow.
Yeah,
You
I'm
know,
a marketer. Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah. But and that's to each his own, and so be it. Whatever. There's people out there, and you can't change that. And
But
the
that's
product,
what's most important to me. That's for sure.
right, is out there,
Authenticity.
right.
Why are you
So
here? Because that really shows if you really understand the product that you're trying to provide a gap in demand for, and that's that. In order for you to put out a good product that you can trust, it has to come from somebody that knows what they're talking about. It
mhm,
can't just be from somebody that wants to take advantage of a situation. And that goes deeper to me. It's like, okay, if you believe this to help people and this is your story behind it, you're most likely, or much more likely, to choose the right ingredients, to put the right quality assurances in place, and so on and so on. So I think it goes deeper from just the story. It's like, who started the company? Where is this
right,
from? How many people do you have that have never consumed cannabis? How that are involved in your equity of your company? You know, that would be mine.
nice, Derek. What about you, man?
Man, I, so I agree full heartedly with Thomas. I'd say that's the most important to me. Is like, what's the soul behind that brand? You know what I mean? Like, I want to feel like when I'm contributing to a brand, because I am with my dollar, that their values align with my values, which is standing for our culture, standing for the plant itself, and being an advocate of, both of those things, and not just some, corporate tycoon that's, like you said, here to just make a bunch of money and basically, rob our culture of everything that we've worked for throughout the last 20, 30 years. But outside of that, it's product quality, like through and through. Is it tested? Is it accurate? Those are the things to me that are super important, because whether you have a soul in your company or not, if you're not putting good products out there, you're just doing a disservice to the whole industry in general. You're hurting people, and I am not an advocate for that at all. So product quality, yeah.
Right. I have to agree. Well, I mean, I agree with both of what you said. I mean, that's what our company is built upon, right? Is our story, our authenticity, and our product quality, but preserving the culture. I think that's really important to me. And how do you preserve that culture while evolving with the industry as well? Right, like
Right.
that poses its own challenges, but I think having that question, at the forefront or among the forefront questions is important. That's important to me, is how to preserve the culture with the evolving industry. That way we can continue to fight the stigma. I think we've beat that horse to death. And there's always opportunity to talk about fighting the stigma, but it's like that. How it's important to me that our cannabis company doesn't represent what people think cannabis is. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like
I
people
mean,
think,
you can't preserve the culture if you've never been a part of the culture, right?
right,
And so
right,
that goes right back to these big, huge companies that have all this money to go in and copy and not be original and steal products from people and put them out like that. But you can't preserve the culture if you don't know what the culture is. And this
right,
culture, the people that the people that made it available for these corporate hogs to come in and take it are the ones that understand culture.
mm,
And if we go away from that, we're going backwards. We're now just giving this culture that has been created to someone else to re-narrate that for us, and that's dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And you know
we
what?
have
I was just going to say, I think what I'm hearing from you, Nadeem, is that there's a lot of positive aspects of our culture that we want to keep, and there's also some negative ones that we want to, reshape. Maybe we don't completely do away with them, but I mean, there are definitely aspects of cannabis culture that could be improved, just like any culture.
right. We've got time for one more question. So, I am Q says, are there best practices for taking psychedelics for the first time? Well,
Oh
yeah.
man, we've talked about this.
Yeah, and so with that being said, maybe Q is new to the show, so let's recap it real quick. And yes, there's absolutely best practices. Number one, know your dose. If you don't know your dose, you can always take more. You can't take less. Do a lot of research, guys. There's a lot of resources out there like maps.org, that provide a lot of solutions on dosing, microdosing, macrodosing, what the differences are. Set and setting should be the first and foremost important factor. We've talked about this a lot, just like on the last episode. If you didn't listen to the last episode, I encourage you to go listen to it. We talked about overconsumption of cannabis and how to work through those bad trips. It's very similar for psychedelics. Best practices are set and setting. Make sure you are in a safe and familiar setting. Do not go to a music festival and take it if it's your first time. I highly encourage you to be, in a safe place like your home or your best friend's home. Somebody else is there with you. Don't be around people that make you feel a certain type of way, because innately those feelings are going to come out, whether you say it or whether just that person's presence amplifies those feelings within. Those are some best practices right off the bat.
For me, this is one that I think is really important. You should treat this event, if you're going to take a psychedelic for the first time at any reasonable dose. You should treat it with the utmost severity that you possibly can. Like you really need to think about what you're doing. You need to really think about why you're doing it. You need to really take the time to plan it and cover all the bases that Nadeem just laid out. Because it's something that has the ability to change your life forever. I mean, there's countless of examples that we could go into on part 2 of people who took this and had immensely positive benefits. And there's also, the opposite, people who took substances like these and it harmed them. So I would say the stakes are a little higher in terms of psychedelics than they are for cannabis. And so, it should be treated as such. It's something that needs to be done responsibly, and it should not be something that's done on a whim for the first
I think
time.
we also forgot about a sitter, right? That also would help that the first time tremendously.
Yes.
And there's a difference between a sitter and a guider, right? So someone just sitting and just listening versus someone that's trying to I don't know what's the right word, educate you in that experience is much different. You just want somebody to be there so you know you're not going to go crazy, man.
Right. I want to touch on that just a little bit, man, since and so to I guess kind of delineate the two or distinguish the two from one another. You know, a trip sitter or a trip, you know, someone to be there with you. I personally would recommend that person being somebody that has done it, right? That has experience with it, because the last thing you want is to be with somebody that hasn't done it, and the one thing they're doing the whole time, are you okay? Are you all right? Are you just adding and fueling that anxiety, right?
Or
Like
saying a word that triggers the wrong response in
Yeah.
that state of mind. Oh my goodness.
So I would
Totally,
say the
because-
first time you need a guide, you don't need a sitter.
yeah,
You
need
know
a
what I mean?
guide.
Like you want somebody who knows exactly how to handle that situation, because let's be real, bad trips happen.
Yeah.
And you don't want somebody who's inexperienced dealing with that.
And I'll end it on this. Going back to Derek's advice is, you know, treat this, you know, with the most severity and have respect for the process. And I think what Derek was concluding to was set an intention. You know, we've talked many times of intentions, but write one out, write one down. What is your intention in this? I want to become a better reader. I want to become a better runner. I want to have more discipline. I want to have more intimacy in my relationships. Like, get granular with it and get weird with it. Like, actually set an intention, because if you go in blindly, you're going to fuck yourself. Like, it's going to happen.
And there's a difference between intention and expectation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So don't be disappointed if you go in thinking, I want to be more disciplined, and you get a bunch of other shit. Well, guess what? That's what should have came up. That's what needed to come up in order for you to get to where you're trying to go to.
That's what
that's a
Sting
big one for
said
me.
in the beginning of that Have a Good Trip documentary. He was saying, set an
Right.
intention and you'll get it in some way, but if you don't, it will fuck you up.
Yeah, it'll fuck you up. And oftentimes it'll fuck you up in the right way too. And you'll find that you actually needed that.
Yeah, right. It's interesting.
It
It'll
just
come
does.
to you too. Because even Derek said, like, take the time, think about what you're doing all the way through this. And if you're not ready, you're not ready, because it will come to a point where you're in so much disarray or so much pain or so much of whatever it is that you're feeling that you'll know it's time. It's like, it's time. This is what I want to try.
Yeah.
And
And just one more thing on the best practices. Just again, a subtle reminder that it's not permanent. It will pass. It's only for, the time being, which could be a few hours. So buckle up, but remind yourself that you're safe. And the reason that it's happening is because you took this. All right, guys, this has been fun. Let's definitely do a part 2, because we have more to cover.
we're going to cover science and the current science.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I want to cover the current terms of psychedelic science and why should somebody care about that, right? Like, there's some pretty cool shit, like some big research halls reopened last year, and that's really important to cover, especially with mental health, and we also want to cover how people are using psychedelics to outside of mental health, right?
We'll see if we get to that. I see part 3 for that for sure.
Well, totally. Hey, everybody, thank you for tuning in. We truly, truly appreciate each and every one of you. Leave us a rating and review. It helps us with algorithm gods. It helps us rank better. If you do like these shows, please share it. And don't forget to ask a question on our next Q&A. You can find that on Instagram. Thank you so much.
If you hate it, tell us why.
Please let us know. Help us get better. Hey, everybody. Quick disclaimer. The Know Your Dose podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only. Let's be real. None of us are doctors. Our content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical or public health advice. Please be smart and always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare professional with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Seriously, never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard on this podcast. That would just be insane.